Welcome back. In this video, we are going to see how we can get the user input from Unity directly into our code so that we can then run code that will basically do something with the user input. In our case, what we want our code to do is to compare the user input with what we have created as the random number, which will later on be generated by our code itself. So for now, we are hard coding the value. So that means that we are defining the value as one number and it will stay that same number all the time. But later we're going to create a unique number or a random number that will change every single time that we run the game. And that is something that we want to achieve. And in order to get the data from Unity to our code, we need to do a couple of steps. And we're going to look at those in this video. So the first thing that we'll do is, well, first of all, let's check out this input field. So this input field will give us data in the form of a string, even though we are saying that the content type will only be an integer. That will become a problem later on, and we're going to see how to fix that. So before we get this problem, let's actually make sure to use this input field in our code. And how can we get this input field in our code? Well, therefore, what we can create is a new variable. Okay, so also here at the top of our GameLogic class, I'm going to create a new public input field. And this will be user input. So I'm going to call it user input. Now I'm getting an error, however. So what is this input field and why do I need to fix it? Because it's an error in our code. Well, the thing is, we are using a class called input field that is not inside of any of the namespaces that we have added to our code. Which means in our case, we only have the Unity engine, but we don't have the Unity engine UI. So let me copy that real quick and add .ui here. This UI namespace holds all of the UI classes. So here, this namespace, for example, holds the input field class, which basically now means that we can use the functionality that is inside of this namespace called UI. For example, input field, which is exactly what we need. So we need to get the input field, which is a UI element. And you can see that if you check here, it's inside of the canvas. And if you right click, you can see it's in UI. UI stands for user interface. And that's where our input field is. So that means inside of UI, you will also find text, image, raw image, button, and so forth. All of those that you have here will be part of it, which basically now allows us to use input fields in our code. So let's for now just use this public input field user input. And you might recall if we make a variable public, it will be visible inside of Unity, as we had with our public int random num. So let's save our script and let's go back to Unity. And now let's go over to our GameLogic, which holds our script, as you might recall, because we called that script also GameLogic, right? And we created this game object, which now holds our script. And on the right-hand side, you can now see that there is not only our random num, but also our user input. Okay, so let's drag our input field in there, because you see the user input is none, and then in brackets input field, which means it's expecting something that is of type input field. So if I drag it in there, you will now see that it says input field, because that's the name of the input field. We didn't change the name, we left it with the default value, and now we dragged it into our user input field variable. So now you can also click on this circle here and go to your scene, and then you will see all of the items that would fit into this description, which means which are of type input field. As we only have one input field, you can see it only accepts this one input field. Let's say we duplicated this input field, and now we go to our GameLogic. You will see both of those input fields will now be made available. That is just because our variable type was exactly of that particular type. Okay, so let me get rid of this extra input field once again, because we don't need it. And now what I can do is I can actually use that input field. So whatever the input field will hold in terms of its values, I can use that in my code. So here I have this variable now, and I assigned the user input from my Unity project to it, which now means I can use it inside of my code. So a good point to use it would be probably once we click on the button, I'd say. So once we click the button, what we want to do is we want to get the user input And then we want to basically later on compare it with the random number. But for now, let's actually make a little change here. So we don't need to have this debug log who clicked me anymore. What I would like to have instead is the user input. So let's use debug log and then use our user input dot. And the thing is, our user input itself is of type user input, but we don't want to have the user input variable, but we want to have the actual text that user input has. So we can use the text property. So here, this is going to be a property, and we're going to see what properties are in depth later on when we are building our own properties, but it would go too far at this point. For now, you should just remember the fact that classes can have multiple properties that describe them, that are basically characteristics of the object. So the characteristics of the user input would be a text, for example, but then you could also change the transform, which means the position and the rotation of that user input and so forth. Okay, but we are only interested in the text for now. So let's use that. And once you hover over this text property, you will see that it says string input field.text. So the string means that the text that we're getting here will be of type string. So it will not be an integer. So let's actually finish the statement using a semicolon here. And let's save the script and go back to Unity. Because in Unity now, we can go ahead and run our game. Enter a value. Here, enter a text, let's say 5, and then press the guess button, go to our console, and it will say 5. Where does this 5 come from? Well, it comes from our user input, so whatever we have entered. So let's say 15, and you can see, now it says 15. By the way, there is this clear button with which you can then clear all of the statements in your console. So if you want to clean your console, that's always a good way. So here, let's enter 25. Let's click on it and you see it says 25. If I were to say 10 now, then the number that I entered would be the same as the random number. So in this case, I would have won. So of course, we would like to then change the text here, for example, to not say new text, but it would say something like you have won, for example. Okay, so that by itself is great, but I would like to have this text in a form, so this input text in the form of a number. How do I do that? Well, that's something that we're going to look at in the next video.